Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and as I do sometimes, I've got some information documented here on this little board. Information about one of the worm bins that I'm planning to feed today. And in this case, the container that I'm going to be bringing out onto the bench momentarily is a, over here, 114-day-old container of ANCs. That's my abbreviation for African night crawlers. And a lot of people have seen my African night crawlers and said, hey, African night crawlers are much more red, dark in color, they're much longer, fatter, everything like that. I'm not really even sure if what I've got here is African night crawlers, so until I'm told otherwise, or I can really identify them positively as being something else, for now I'm just continuing to call them African night crawlers. And so far, over those 114 days, the bin has received 12 feedings at various intervals. Sometimes I wait a week, sometimes I wait close to 2 weeks, whatever the case may be, as my schedule permits. And it's a pretty busy bin because I've got an estimated 2,000 worms in that system, and that estimate is based on what I thought the number of worms in there was, and I usually combine that with estimates that I get from the viewers when I'm showing the worms and I get feedback. People thinking, hey, how many do you think you got in there? It's been 9 days now since the last feeding, and the last thing I've got written here is the fact that we've been definitely observing some mite activity in this bin. So much so that I sometimes even slow the camera down so that we can see these really slow-moving mites moving. Because if you, if you play back the video footage very fast, you can actually see these slow-moving creatures actually all buzzing around. And we might do that today, depending on how many we see. I believe in the last feeding we found an avocado that was kind of teeming with these mites, so we actually extracted that food and removed it, in the hopes that we might be able to reduce the mite population slightly in the bin. So I guess we'll see what we see when we get in there. I did feed certain things that would probably draw mites last time. Stuff like cantaloupe rinds, which is also on the menu today. At first I thought I was maybe shooting myself in the foot to be giving the bin stuff that's really going to, cause mite activity. But then I thought to myself, hey, you know what? That might be exactly what I've got to do to get the mites to come to the stuff that I'm putting in there, because I've decided I'm going to give this stuff over here a try. This is something I had tried once before to combat the mites. It's a form of neem oil which never worked for me, and I think later on I found out why, because there does seem to be a distinction between neem oil that's been so-called cold pressed. It's a processing term, I guess, but basically there are certain neem oils that have been cold pressed and types that haven't been. To my misfortune, the type that I went and I bought for myself was not cold pressed. But then a buddy of mine came by the other day telling me about his garden and stuff that he's doing to try to combat insects, and he said he had purchased a package of neem oil, and then right away I asked him, is that stuff cold pressed that you bought? He bought this concentrated stuff, so you have to mix it with water and dilute it and come up with the solution. So he was good enough to mix up a batch of this stuff for me. And the stuff that he bought is in fact cold pressed. He actually bought the container over and showed me the writing on the packaging that said that it was cold pressed. So I've gone ahead and I've taken a squirt bottle that I've rinsed out thoroughly that I'm going to use as an applicator. So today's fairly routine feeding of my worm bin is going to include sort of a return to trying to deal with the mites, which is something I've not done in quite a while. For a couple months now I've just been kind of ignoring the mites, but I thought to myself, hey, if I've got the stuff that supposedly really works well on reducing their numbers, let's give it a try. So I'm going to go ahead and get this glove on, and we'll get that bin out here on the bench, and we'll get to work. Uh-oh. You know what? I better call my buddy to make sure I'm not putting some sort of weird stuff in here, because he said he's giving me neem oil, but what he's written here is ream oil. Maybe I should give him a call just to make sure I'm not going to be spraying a bunch of stuff into my worm bin that's not intended for insect control. Alright, my guess is that he just fat-fingered it and typoed it. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. My hope is that what we've got in here is in fact a neem oil mix, not some sort of weird reaming oil or some sort of machinist oil. Because I guess if you're a machinist, you might be reaming holes or something like that, and then you might be using some sort of oil for that. But I don't think that my buddy would have mixed up something like that, at least not to that degree. So now I've been keeping the surface on the top of my bins a little bit drier than I've done in the past. In the past, I was covering with plastic. What we saw right there was just newspaper and a coffee filter and a piece of cardboard on the very tippy top covering things, which does result in somewhat drier material on the surface, but you certainly don't have to go down deep to get to some nice moist castings, and right away we're already bumping into a worm. So yeah, I mean, you know, some of these worms, if you had to look at one and try to identify it, you wouldn't think a worm this size is an African nightcrawler. I believe that's the primary reason most of the feedback I get about these worms is that they might not be African nightcrawlers based on their size. Although I was watching one of the other worming channels the other day, and I believe it was Anne over at the Plant Obsessed channel who said that she had received African nightcrawlers once upon a time, and that at the time they were, you know, when they were first shipped to her, they were huge, they were the size of a pencil, and that over time they've grown smaller and smaller. Perhaps it's got something to do with the diet that they're fed. So maybe she and I are seeing the same thing. Maybe African nightcrawlers just kind of adapt to their environment and maybe don't grow quite as large if they're in a somewhat smaller space, or maybe it's their diet. I don't know what it is, but I really don't know. Sometimes I hear things from the viewers that make me question whether these are African nightcrawlers, and then sometimes I hear stuff like what I just heard there, making me think that, hey, maybe they are African nightcrawlers. So I think the jury is still out on that. So perhaps someday I'll be able to get one of these worms under a microscope or take a photograph and count their rings and identify the position of their clitellum, or use one of these positive identification techniques to figure out exactly what kind of worms I have inhabiting this bin here. So I am thinking that since this is kind of a test of the cold filtered neem oil to see if we're gonna maybe someday get rid of our mites using that stuff, maybe we do a quick time lapse here. If we can find a section of the material down here where the bin was last fed that looks like it might have some mites in it, and then try to use the time lapse as a quick way to actually see what we've got as far as mite numbers. I mean, with the large number of them reduced, hopefully by removing the avocado, last time I spotted lots of mites, maybe we're helping to reduce their numbers. Although I would think that removing 1 or 2 chunks of food that had a bunch of them on there isn't even really going to put much of a dent into the population. I would think that probably accounts for a fairly small number of the mites that inhabit this stuff. So my hope was that I might bump into a piece of cantaloupe or something that might have a bunch of them on there, but you can see these chunks of cantaloupe skin have been stripped clean of all the fleshy fruit. So I think the best bet might just be to get a simple observation of this material here in general to see if, you know, besides worm movement, are we also observing any mite movement. So let's do a quick time lapse to see what we see, then we'll resume our work here. So now, of all my bins, I thought that this was one of the more active ones as far as mite activity, but I can't really tell just from looking in real time at the activity here. I'll only really know once I get the footage up on my computer and am able to watch the time-lapse footage playback fast. So I don't even really know if there's a whole lot of mite activity in here to concern myself about. But since I've got this neem oil here, I thought I might just give the contents a little shot, at least the sections where there's been food, because that's probably where the mites have been congregating, trying to get a bite to eat. So I'm just going to bring in the squirt bottle that I've loaded up with this neem oil concoction, and I just thought I'd kind of work my way through some of the stuff that had been down in the feeding area, which is where I would probably expect the majority of the mites to be hanging out. And it's not the sort of thing where you would just suddenly see a whole bunch of mites, you know, kicking up their feet and X's on their eyes. It's not going to necessarily affect the well-being of the mites that we're spraying here right now. As I understand it, the way the stuff actually works is that it interferes with the ability of the mites to reproduce. So it's actually the next generation of mites that you're sort of preventing the propagation of by using this stuff. So it's the sort of test that it will take a little bit of time to yield results. And I don't want to go too crazy, excessively dampening the material here in the bin. I'm sure the worms don't mind a little extra moisture. I just don't want to end up with excessively damp material. Man, this squirt bottle makes a lot of noise. I think when it's running a little bit low, that's when it makes a lot of noise. Because when I filled it up with water and I was squirting it in the sink, trying to rinse it out, it was making no noises like that. So now, I guess the other idea I had here was that maybe I could bring some of this material that's out on the outer edges where there has been no food, maybe bringing that into the middle. Because this stuff definitely seems a little bit more dry. And then maybe that more damp stuff that I just sprayed down, which had been down the middle, which is where the foods had been and where all the activity had been, maybe kind of work that stuff to the outskirts and then use the more dry material that had been out on the outer edges as the stuff to place today's feeding into. So let's see if we can do it that way, and then this way the moisture situation in this bin can sort of be evened out a little bit. You can see there's worms pretty much everywhere within this material. Everywhere within the bin, even the slightly drier stuff out on the outer edges seems to have pretty good numbers of worms in them. And I guess the other nice thing about doing what I just did there was that I did have a chance to sort of fluff up the entire contents of the bin. So I didn't really encounter too many spots where it seemed like stuff was compressing or condensing or getting overly dense, luckily. But it was at least a good chance to verify that I didn't have anything like that going on anywhere within the bin. It always seems to be a good thing to fluff the material in your bins up. Make sure that all the contents have a good opportunity to get airflow and air circulation, and you know, just in general a space or kind of a material that the worms can easily travel through. So I think I've managed to bring a good amount of the drier stuff that was on the outskirts inboard around the space where we're going to be applying today's feeding. You can see that there's bedding materials all around within this bin. There's all kinds of shredded paper. There's remnants of leaves that had been used as bedding. Something I've been doing in my slightly older bins, such as this one, bins that are now over 100 days old. Even though even before this bin reached 100 days of age, I was already beginning to use less and less of the leaves, since the leaves all bring in their stems, and then you end up with tons of stems in your material. Even after the leafy stuff has all been consumed by the worms, it takes a little bit longer for the stems to break down, so I try to use less and less of that sort of stuff as bedding. So we're going to continue that same theme here with today's feeding. What I did bring down here was some shreds of paper. Usually I've been lately using a lot of shredded paper that has been run through my shredder as the bedding to use as part of my feedings, but I'm going to kind of do a more low-tech shredding of the paper here to include with today's feeding. And we'll maybe even kind of try to crumble it up so we don't just end up with a bunch of matted up material at the bottom of this feeding area. Maybe something that's got a little bit of air pockets in it. I usually like to place bedding beneath my feedings so that whatever moisture gets emitted from the feedings gets absorbed by that freshly added bedding, making that bedding a little bit more appealing as far as a food source for the worms. Because to me, these paper-based things, the leaves, the things that are often considered by most to be a bedding material, to me it seems like it's a bedding material if it is in fact a bunch of really finely shredded stuff and applied in great amounts. And then it really does seem like it's a material that the worms can actually bed in and rest in or go hang out in. But when you only apply little bits of it, like I've done here with this paper, to me it seems like it's going straight into the category of food. It's just rather than a nitrogen kind of rich food source like the foods that they normally get, it's more of the balance to the diet. So it's the carbon rich balance to their food. So I'm not going too overboard on the feeding today. I've been thinking about maybe gearing up for foraging in this bin soon. And if you're not familiar with what that is, I like to run my bins, you know, for a period of time up until I get to the point where I'd really like to start steering things towards harvest. And in order to be able to harvest a batch of nice vermicompost, you want to see all these little scraps of stuff in here all broken down. So rather than giving them fresh foods constantly, I'll eventually taper off to the point where I give them nothing for quite some time and let them really just focus on eating up the remnants of foods and bedding materials that are already in the bin. And that's why I use that expression foraging. It's not an expression that I came up with. It was something one of the viewers said in one of the comments of my videos long ago, and it just seemed like such an appropriate description of what you're trying to get the worms to do at that point that I've pretty much adopted it as my way of describing what's going on in my bins that have pretty much completed their everyday composting phases and have transitioned to the point where the worms are just really working down what remains in the bin to get things ready for a harvest. So let's see, I think I've pretty much hit the mark on all the different things I was trying to get done here. I'm wondering if maybe just a little bit more of this neem oil placed in near where the food is going to be might also help accomplish the goal of reducing the number of mites in the system. Since we're adding a bunch of dry stuff over here, I don't feel so bad applying a bunch of moisture. And I'm sure the worms don't mind. So yeah, look at that, all these worms hanging out. It's a fun bin, you know, when you got a bin where you estimate the number of worms in it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 strong, it's certainly a fun bin because you're never at a loss of worms. There's always worms hanging out everywhere. And we did do a pretty thorough agitation of the material in here too, so we pretty much scattered the worms throughout this stuff. So it's fun. Fun bin. Definitely a fun bin. Yeah, all my bins are fun. I think I say that at the end of every feeding. But the ones that are really crowded and really active definitely rise to the top as far as being the most fun. Alright, I really don't feel like I've missed anything, although that is kind of a common theme in my videos. I always seem to forget something. But I think we've pretty much taken care of everything here. We've done the neem oil application so that we could see if it maybe helps reduce mite numbers. We've done our short little time lapse to see if it reveals how many mites we actually have in here, even though I did remove a good number of them recently. I do suspect that there is still a good number of mites remaining in this system. And we've given them a food after 9 days since their last feeding, and it seems like it was due, because there certainly wasn't a whole lot as far as leftovers from the last feeding. Or at least that's what it looked like to me. So I think we're done here. All I've got left now is just to put some stuff away and get things cleaned up, but I'm not going to bore you with that. That's just mundane, boring stuff. So I think I'll end the video here. So before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.